As of the time of me making this video, we are now officially into the third month of the Paramount Era. And while we have had some fun fights and some fun finishes and some interesting fight announcements, here's my overall impression of the Paramount Era so far. It's bad. Like, really bad. From putting together bad cards, to underpaying fighters, to having too many ads, including ads for sponsors that have the potential to be the center of an even bigger MMA betting scandal than those that have happened in the past, the Paramount Era isn't exactly looking too bright so far. And now that
Brazil's
goodest golem, Donald Trump, has gone ahead and potentially started World War III by assassinating the leader of a rival country, I can't say it's exactly a great look that the UFC is basically putting on an event for his birthday party on his front lawn. And on top of all of that, with Netflix beginning to get into the MMA business with Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano, we might see the rise of the first MMA event in the United States that is competitive with the UFC in terms of viewership. And all of these factors may come together to culminate in the UFC losing out on top upcoming talent, becoming less exciting, or even declining in popularity. And in this video, we're going to go over all these hurdles for the UFC and why I think the promotion will face some struggles in the near future. So without further waiting, let's get started. So starting off with the most immediate problem that I and many other fans have with the UFC right now, it has to be how bad the cards and matchmaking have been so far. So looking at the numbered events so far, UFC 324 was literally headlined with an interim title between Paddy Pimblett and Justin Gaethje, which turned out to be a fun fight, but neither one of those guys looked like they were in the top 10, let alone top 5 lightweights in the world. And UFC 325 was one of the most pointless title defenses of all time, with Volkanovski using up one of the final fights of his career to beat Diego Lopez yet again, who the UFC desperately wanted to have win so that they can tap into the ever-elusive Mexican market, which I personally believe doesn't even exist, at least not to the extent that Dana White thinks it does. And don't you forget that UFC 325 had Tai Tuivasa versus Talishan Teixeira on the main card. On the main card! UFC 327 is the first numbered event of the Paramount Era that has truly felt like a numbered event, being headlined with a light heavyweight and flyweight title. But even then, I might be overrating this card because I personally am such a big fan of Yuri and Tyra and have a vested interest in seeing them win. And then you look at the fight night main events. And while some of these are pretty damn alright, like Adesanya versus Pyfer and JDM versus CP, the really bad ones just stick out like sore thumbs. I mean, Renato Moicano versus Chris Duncan? This fight wouldn't be out of place on the early prelims of a numbered event. But nope, instead it's going to be main eventing at the Apex. And yeah, I like Chris Duncan a lot, but he's not a big enough of a name to be main eventing a card. And then you have Gilbert Burns, who is on a 4-fight loss streak and looked absolutely washed against Michael Morales, main eventing in Winnipeg, Canada against Mike Mallet. Yes, the Neil Magny victim himself, Mike Mallet. I'm sorry, but this is just absolutely abysmal. Like, couldn't you have at least made something decentish for the main event here? Like Dricus du Plessis versus Brendan Allen, or even Corey Sandhagen versus Ayman Zahabi. I mean, Zahabi is a Canadian citizen, the fight makes sense rankings-wise, and the winner of this fight could warrant a title eliminator. But no, we've got the 34-year-old Canadian prospect who failed the Neil Magny test being unceremoniously forced up the rankings by sacrificing Gilbert Burns once again by sending him to the proverbial glue factory. And the worst part about these main events is that you know that every fight beneath these main events is going to be mid. For Moicano versus Duncan, there's Dion Barboza versus Melissa Gatto, and Azamat Bekoev versus Tresean Gore, the latter of whom is literally 5-4 in his career, the record of a journeyman on the regional scene, not a guy who is supposed to be in the quote-unquote best promotion in the world. And for Burns versus Mallet, you have Mitch Raposo fighting on the card, who shouldn't even be in the UFC since he lost on both Dana White's Contender Series and on The Ultimate Fighter. And then you have an unranked women's bantamweight fight on the card, which I'm guessing is supposed to be the official beer refill and toilet break of the card. And on the UFC Perth card, they're still giving Junior Tafa fights in the UFC. Yes, Junior Tafa, who is 6-5 in his career and has 2 wins and 5 losses in the UFC and who has 0 ground game. They're still giving Junior Tafa fights. And then, if you look at the other cards, there's other matchmaking that just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. For UFC London, for example, you have a main event of Movsar Evlov versus Laurel Murphy. Now, either one of these guys could have been booked to fight Volkanovski at UFC 325, but instead they're fighting each other. Another abomination of matchmaking on this card is Michael Venom Page versus Sam Patterson, where MVP, who is also a Muslim doing his training camp during Ramadan, is fighting an unranked welterweight in Sam Patterson, despite the fact that MVP beat 2 ranked middleweights in Shah Magomedov and Jared Cannonier in his past 2 fights. However, there's a reason why I think the UFC is giving MVP this matchup that does nothing for his career, and that is the fact that Michael Venom Page is speaking up about being underpaid.
Yeah, it's not something that I'm happy about. So what I would say is, when the announcement of the Paramount, big money partnership came, people was asking me, how do you, excited about this? And my answer was, well, what does that mean for the fighters? Until we understand how that's going to translate to the fighters, there's nothing to really be excited about. And then, I heard about the if you want to call it an increase in bonus structure. And this is why I wasn't bothered to be excited initially, because for me, that doesn't do enough comparatively to the amount of money that they've just brought in for themselves. And then to see, obviously, Dana White, he's always been quite excited about going into the kind of the boxing world and kind of doing other things like the slap fighting and all that kind of stuff. But then to see it and how quickly he values people away from, how highly he values people away from the sport that kind of built his reputation, it's just upsetting, to be fair. It's disappointing more than anything. And that's probably all I'll say on that.
As MVP pointed out in that clip, the UFC is still severely underpaying their fighters. But now, with the creation of Zuffa Boxing, the TKO group as a whole is now overpaying for boxers like Conor Benn, who is getting $15 million for a single fight. And while the Saudis are apparently footing the bill for this, when you consider the fact that according to their 2025 earnings report, the UFC had an EBITDA margin of 57%, which is basically the profit of a business before interest payments and taxes, you can tell why even veteran fighters like Max Holloway are beginning to speak up about being underpaid.
This Paramount deal, and hopefully fighters can start getting together, being smart. And one time it's always gonna stick out to my mind was when I love Derek Lewis, man, he's a man, but when John Jones said, oh, I'll fight Francis, I think so, he's like, give me $10 million or whatever it was, and UFC said, hell no, we're not paying you that, right? Derek Lewis, I believe, was ranked at the time, and he said, what? You want to do this for 10? Give me a meal, I'll fight Francis now. It's like, man, we cannot be doing that, brother. You need to be like, yeah, John, you needed to almost stand in John's corner, be like, yeah, John, you deserve 10, go get that 10. Because guess what? If you fighting for 10, then it looks like your base pay probably comes up too. You know what I mean? This guy's making it. So I hope that that these new fighters coming in, just know your worth, man. The main thing I would say, know your worth, know what it is. It's gonna suck, you know what I mean? We was on some
3-3. 3-3.
Yeah, bro, and we was in some heated conversations when we was getting back into that talk. So at the end of the day, hold your ground, bro. UFC know what your worth is, and
yeah, it's really bad when literal legends of the sport are speaking up about how bad the pay is and calling for fighters to stick up for each other. And for reference, having an EBITDA margin of 40% is considered to be really good. The UFC is at 57%, which is absurdly good, unnaturally good, and it's coming at the expense of the fighters. And as I'll get to later, This kind of wage suppression could be something that a competitor like Netflix and Most Valuable Promotions could exploit to steal away top talent that could go to the UFC instead. I'll also add that this isn't good for MMA in the long run, since the lower purses in mixed martial arts will incentivize potential combat sports athletes to compete in boxing instead, where the potential payout is many times higher. And I mean, we have already seen this happen with Francis Ngannou fighting Tyson Fury, and now the kickboxing legend Rico Verhoeven turning down an offer from the UFC to go box Alexander Usyk instead. Just imagine how much better the UFC heavyweight division would be if, instead of having Taliesin Teixeira and Tai Tuivasa, we had Francis Ngannou and Rico Verhoeven. It would be stacked. Genuinely stacked. But now, let's talk about how Paramount Plus is trying to make back the $7.7 billion they spent on the UFC, which is apparently by stuffing every last corner of the screen with ads. There's ads between rounds, ads during walkouts, ads on the octagon, ads on the fighters, and ads being read aloud by John Anik at the start of every round. And as I pointed out in my video on how the UFC pushes degeneracy, most of what the UFC is advertising can be classified as demerit goods. You know, alcohol, nicotine, and gambling. However, there is one particular sponsor that I have to call out right here, right now, and that is Polymarket, the UFC's lead betting sponsor as of now. And now, I'm sure that most of you know what Polymarket is, but just to briefly explain, it's basically an alternative to traditional gambling like DraftKings and Stake.com, where instead of there being a house that is the bookmaker, you trade shares between peers about what you think will happen regarding a given event. In addition to betting on outcomes like who do you think will win between Yuri Prohaska and Carlos Ulberg, or will Joshua Van versus Tatsuro Taira go the distance, you can place bets, or as Polymarket likes to say, buy shares in propositions like who will Petr Yan fight next, or will Trump attend UFC 327? And it is specifically with these proposition bets that I see a potential for a massive betting scandal. In fact, if there was a Polymarket prediction for will Polymarket be the center of a UFC betting scandal, that would be the only prediction I would ever personally put money on. And here's why. So my last long-form video, The Comprehensive Guide to Japanese MMA, took me about 3 weeks to make, from planning to scripting to recording to editing. And in this video, I mentioned that Yuri Prohaska would be headlining UFC 327 above Joshua Van versus Tatsuro Taira. And the reason why I was able to get this video, which is relevant to the main and co-main event of UFC 327, out so quickly after the official announcement on Dana White's Instagram Live, is that I knew about them in advance. Now, I won't reveal my sources, but I knew about those fights. And I'm just a YouTuber, not some industry insider. And that is why proposition bets on Polymarket like who will X fight next, or who will be the champion of X division at the end of 2026, are destined to become the center of another betting scandal for the UFC. The UFC has already had betting scandals happen with the likes of James Krause's insider betting and Isaac Dolgarian purposefully losing against Yadir Doval, but Polymarket's prediction market trading is far, far, far too easy to manipulate and take advantage of. Industry insiders wouldn't just be able to place and win money off of knowing if a fighter is injured or had a bad weight cut or something like that, as it is the case right now. But now, with Polymarket, they can do even more heinous things. I mean, if you're working in MMA management, you're guaranteed to know who will be fighting who, so you can rob fans blind regarding the prop bets about future matchups. And regarding stuff like who will be the next pound-for-pound top fighter, if you are on the committee that does the rankings, you can literally manipulate that yourself. And be honest with me here. Would you put it above an insider like Ali Abdelaziz or Tiki Gozan to engage in this kind of trading? For example, let's say that you're Ali Abdelaziz, who is Manel Kape's manager. When it comes to the proposition bet of whether Manel Kape will become a UFC champion or not in 2026, and you know that the UFC wants to give title shots to Taira, Pantoja, and maybe even Koji Horiguchi before they give a title shot to Kape, then you can make bank by just buying the no on this proposition, since you can be 100% sure that Manel won't even get an opportunity to fight for the belt. These proposition bets are so easy to manipulate and so easy to make money off of as an insider that I'm surprised we haven't seen a scandal around them already. But anyways, let's now move on to the juicy political stuff, which involves
Brazil's
greatest supporter and defender, the Big Don. Now, at the time that I'm making this video, none of the fights for the White House card have been announced. Now, Dana White has said that he will be announcing them soon, but hey, there's still some mystery around who will be on there. However, when you take recent political developments into mind, I have to say this. No matter who is on the White House card, being in bed with the Trump administration will hurt the reputation of the UFC at this point. As I discussed in my video, Why is MMA so right-wing? I am of the belief that mixed martial arts inherently leans to the right politically. This is due to a variety of factors, such as the majority of the viewership being composed of young men, to heavily leaning into sports nationalism, and many of the sport's most memorable fights being built up around racial and religious tensions. However, I believe that the White House card will most likely not hit home with the UFC's core demographic, which is young men, precisely because of what the Trump administration has done recently in Iran. By starting an armed conflict despite having promised to his base that he would avoid starting further wars, Trump...
I am the candidate of peace.
We do not want war with Iran. We actually want peace. The Iranians are clearly not very good at war. Perhaps they should follow President Trump's lead and give peace a chance.
Kamala's campaigning with warmongers like Liz Cheney. How do you think that is?
Although at this point, all I can say is that if you trusted Trump, you need one of those "fell for it again" awards stapled onto your skull. The young men who voted for and supported Trump did not want war in Iran precisely because they had seen the grueling, drawn-out forever wars that had happened in places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and how young men like themselves had been sent to die in droves for the interests of a certain group of elites. With his armed conflict against Iran, Donald Trump has expended the last shred of social credit he had with young men, who are more or less disgusted by his warmongering on behalf of the
Brazil
lobby. And while the UFC may be right-wing, it is currently deeply intertwined with the most despised political faction in the modern world, the establishment right, composed of geriatric warmongers. Nobody likes this group, from the center-left soccer moms, to the genderqueer Marxists, to the Groypers, to even active and openly conservative UFC fighters like Sean Strickland. And the UFC is going to be doing what is essentially the biggest sports washing event in the history of mixed martial arts, and the biggest sports washing event in the history of combat sports since the Rumble in the Jungle in 1974, right on the White House lawn. And nobody but the dumbest, die-hard boomer Trump fans and the biggest, most power and clout-hungry ass-kissers are going to actually think it's a good look. However, that's not the only problem with the Trump administration and the armed conflict against Iran. And that's because the war, if it continues to escalate, will cause major logistical issues for the UFC. In retaliation against American strikes, including the strike that killed the Ayatollah, the Iranian military has retaliated by striking the United Arab Emirates and Qatar. One of the targets that was hit was Dubai International Airport, causing some damage and resulting in the Dubai International and Al Maktoum airports in Dubai and the Zayed International Airport in Abu Dhabi temporarily having commercial flights suspended. The UAE's airports are a crucial set of transportation hubs for many fighters, including those who live in Russia and the former Soviet Union, like Islam Makhachev, Magomed Ankalaev, Alexander Volkov, and others. If the conflict escalates, we could end up seeing air travel in the region being completely suspended, resulting in the UFC being unable to get these fighters to their destinations. And that would be genuinely terrible for the sport. We would also no longer see fight cards in Abu Dhabi and Doha, which are a major source of revenue for the UFC due to the Emiratis and Qataris paying exorbitant site fees for events there, which would end up harming the UFC's bottom line. So yes, war is bad, and it is going to be especially bad for the UFC. But anyways, the final thing I want to talk about in this video is Netflix's new venture into mixed martial arts, with their inaugural event being headlined by Ronda Rousey versus Gina Carano. Now, first of all, I have to say that I think that this fight will absolutely suck. It's going to be for 5 rounds, which means that, unless there's a quick finish, the fight has a really good chance of becoming a stinker. And since Ronda is 39 and Gina is 44, I doubt they'll have the physicality to finish each other. However, this fight has 2 things going for it, which are its name value and the platform it's on. Ronda Rousey is one of the few fighters to have achieved genuine superstardom in the sport, and is the only female fighter to have done so. Gina Carano is also quite famous for having been a WMMA pioneer and an actress. And since this fight will be broadcast on Netflix, it will reach far more viewers, and especially casual viewers, than the UFC on Paramount Plus, simply due to the gap in subscriber count. And while this fight card still hasn't been built yet, Netflix and most valuable promotions have an opportunity to seriously hurt the UFC depending on which fighters they are able to bring over and whether they are able to build those fighters into stars. Now, apparently, most valuable promotions have been planning to match up Jilton Almeida against Junior Dos Santos, which would have been kinda but just imagine if instead of that, they brought in young upcoming prospects who they could build to their audience while having Ronda versus Carano as their big draw. Like, imagine if on the undercard of Ronda versus Carano, they had fighters like Baisanger Chamsudanov, or Baki as he's commonly known in France, or Salhadin Parnassi have a fight there. It would work the same if Netflix and most valuable promotions were able to sign someone like Francis Ngannou, or have Jake Paul make an MMA debut. And as was just recently announced, Tom Aspinall has signed with Eddie Hearn's management agency, Matchroom. And as you guys might already know, Eddie Hearn is like Dana White's #1 enemy. So if Tom Aspinall ends up, leaving the UFC, we might end up seeing Tom Aspinall versus Francis Ngannou on something like a Netflix MMA card, which, at least for me, would be the real determiner of who is the baddest man on the planet. Above something like a John Jones versus Alex Pereira, or an Alex Pereira versus Cyril Gane, if you get what I'm saying. Netflix has the money to offer a huge purse to upcoming prospects and established names on the regional scene, which would end up pressuring the UFC to either raise their own purses or lose out on having the best talent. And since the main strength of the UFC is that it ostensibly has the best MMA talent in the world, having its stranglehold on MMA talent being challenged by Netflix and most valuable promotions could seriously hurt them. And with how the UFC has been phoning it in since the ESPN era, with everything from keeping around low-level talent to fill fight cards, to having inactive champions, to even little things like having Dana White announce fights on Instagram Live instead of there being something cool like a press conference or a ceremony, I think the UFC deserves to fail a bit. The UFC must be taken down a peg or two, whether it is by fan backlash or competition from Netflix or fighters banding together to demand higher pay, before anything at the company improves. But anyways, that is the end of the video. Just a little rant I wanted to get out of the way. Thank you for listening to me vent. Goodbye.